Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
More and more, we're seeing clients and non-clients alike adding a second, third, fourth, or fifth practice. And this is a trend that has been accelerating for about the last 12 years. And the last two, since 2020, it's really gone into overdrive. And I have to say that I'm being asked about this now more than at any point in the past in my career. So look, an additional office can be a blessing or a curse. It all comes down to how you go about doing it. And it's with that in mind that we're dedicating this episode of Dental Business RX to that very subject. Multiple practices, the do's and don'ts. I'm Jeff Bloomberg and I'm your host. And I want to just jump right into this. Let's take an average scenario. I have a client and the client comes up to me and they want to ask my opinion. They have another office for sale in their area and they want to ask my opinion as to whether or not they should buy this practice. Now, obviously, that client is going to do whatever it is that they want to do. They're just asking for my advice. You know, everybody's responsible for their own condition. So, and I say the same thing to you. You've got to make your own decisions in this. But so they're going to ask me, should I do this? Well, I'm going to come to my decision or give them my opinion based on about 7 factors, which is what I'm going to structure this podcast around. These 7 questions I'm going to ask this client. And obviously, the more familiar I am with the ins and outs of that client's individual situation, the less questions I'm going to have to ask. But these are generally the 7 points I'm going to want to know about. So I'll just roll through them and sort of give you my thoughts on it as we go. And you can take these 7 points and apply it to a situation if you're looking at buying an additional office. Now, the first question I'm going to ask them is why? Why are they looking at adding another location? You know, I want to know what is their motivation. And obviously, I'm going to want to know about the practice that they're buying. You know, is this a good deal or not, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But why? Is the motivation because they're doing well and they want to expand? Is the motivation that they hate their current office and everything's wrong with it, so they need another one? Or is the motivation that maybe they've maxed out in their current space and there's no opportunity for expansion? All right. So let's pick up each of those. So let's say the client's just doing really well and wants to expand. Well, good. All right. Then I would move on from there. But let's say they really hate office number 1. The office is doing poorly. They can't find good staff. They have trouble training staff. Their schedule's out of control. They're working too much. It's just not going well. They don't like the location. There's a lot of things wrong with it. Well, here's the thing. The common denominator between both of these locations, whether you're at both of them or not, is going to be you because you're the owner of both. If location 1 is going poorly, that has something to do with you. So I would want to fix that before we take that same condition, which is creating the problems in location 1, and put it in 2 locations, instead of having one pile of garbage, or maybe that's a bad analogy, but just one thing not going well. Now I have 2, why not? In that case, I would probably advise them against it. Let's fix office 1 first. Now, this last point is kind of an interesting point. Let's say they are in a downtown area and they've got 4 operatories and they cannot expand. There's no additional space in their building. There's nowhere nearby to move. So the idea for expansion is, I'm going to open up another office. Well, that might be a valid idea. But one thing I would normally point out to a client in that situation is generally they're not in the office as much as they are paying to be in the office. All right. You're paying rent for 30 days a month. And maybe your building isn't open every day, but it's probably open a lot later than you're there. There's a chance they could expand their hours and actually increase their productivity without expanding their personal hours. We've done this with clients, especially in downtown areas where space is at a premium. We do something we call a split shift, where maybe this doctor works from, 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, 4 days a week. All right. Well, instead, in that case, they open up 5 or 6, and maybe the owner doctor works 7 to 2, 4 days a week. And then they bring associates and additional staff in to cover the other shift, right? There's 2 shifts going on in the practice at that point. The practice is actually open about 45 hours, 50 hours a week, but each shift is taking 25, plus hours a week. And you essentially have 2 offices crammed into one space. That's always a viable alternative. All right. And I've seen people do that and open the second location. I mean, generally, I've also seen people rent, a couple suites over or across the street if space is at a premium, as opposed to opening location 2. Or they could do both, but I wouldn't make that my only motivation. Like if it were up to me and I could get more space where I am, I wouldn't open that second office, then don't open the second office. Just figure out a way to expand on the space that you're in. So that would be the first thing I'd want to know is why. The second thing I'm going to want to know is, and it leads back to what I was talking about a second ago, is your house in order at your current location? If your house isn't in order at your first location, those problems are not going to just magically go away by opening office number 2. And by house in order, I mean things are under control, production is good, profitability is good. If you were making hardly any profit location 1 and you want to open location 2, I'd want to figure out what was wrong with 1 first. Obviously, look, if you've got a lot of debt service because it's a newer office, I understand. But if you've got a situation where your profit is just really horrible because it's being run poorly, why do you want to do that in 2 places? All right. So I would say make sure your house is in order before you open location number 2, which brings us to the next thing, which is where is location number 2? Now, this one's a tricky one. I mean, whether it's existing or a practice opening from scratch, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But where you put this office is of critical importance. You don't want it too far so that it becomes a drag to go there all the time, which is actually the lesser of 2 evils from having it too close. And let me explain to the problem with having it too close. And I've seen people do this before. So I want you to imagine you have a successful office and you're in an area where people will drive, 7 to 10 miles to go see the dentist, right? I mean, every area is different. If you're in Manhattan, 12 blocks is another world. In the area we're in, Tampa Bay, I drive, 22 minutes to see my dentist. So people are used to driving a little bit more here. It's really situational depending on your locale. So let's say in your area, people will drive 7 to 10 miles to go see the dentist. And your office is doing great, so you want to open a second office. So you open an office 7 miles away. And I've actually seen this mentality before. You think, well, we could even share patients between the practices, okay? That is a terrible idea. Please don't ever do that. I've seen people do this. Matter of fact, I saw one person do it where they built an office with that idea. The offices could share patients, all right? They dropped a ton of money into both offices, and essentially they had 1 practice and 2 rents, okay? 1 practice, 2 rents, because patients just sort of went back and forth. It was an administrative nightmare. The way I would think with it is this. Is your practice too close? Well, think with it this way. I want you to imagine that you have these 2 offices and a buyer comes along and wants to buy one of them. Let's say put yourself in that buyer's shoes for a second. You're going to stay in one of the offices and the buyer is going to buy the other because you always want an asset to where you could sell it if you felt like it. Whether you sell it or not is immaterial, but you want it to at least be able to sell. If you have a house, you want to have the house in a position to, if you want to ever sell it, you can, right? So you got these 2 offices and buyer comes along and they only want to buy one. And let's say you take that buyer's attitude or viewpoint for a second. Would you buy one of the offices if the doctor was going to stay in the other one? If they're too close, you wouldn't, because the patients would just flee that office you just bought or that guy just bought or girl just bought to the office where the other owner doctor was still practicing if they're too close. Do you follow? So you don't ever, ever, ever want to do that. You want to make sure that these can stand alone. I mean, maybe a patient travels between the 2 of them once in a blue moon, but you want to make sure that these 2 offices can stand alone on their own without being dependent upon each other. Unless someone's going to come along and buy both offices, but I wouldn't open the second location too close with that idea in mind. And obviously, again, if it's too far, it's 4 hours away, it's just going to be a drag and you're going to hate the fact that you bought it. So I wouldn't do that. All right. Now that brings us to the next point. So here's this second office. You're in office number 1 and office number 1 is successful, but are you going to work in office number 2? That's a big question. Now, the answer to this and, what my response would be is so varied because every situation is different. I can't give you just a pat 1-sentence answer, right? But what I can do is give you a couple different scenarios and show you some of the problems and things that you're going to want to think about. So let's say you've decided you're opening this second office or you're buying this second practice and you're going to work there I don't know, 1 or 2 days a week, right? So you're in your main location. Let's say you're practicing on your own in the main location and you work 4 days a week and you're going to break off 1 or 2 of those days to go work in this second office. I probably would not recommend that unless you had some coverage at Office One. So here's the thing to think with. Office One, if it is doing well and paying the bills and keeping you going and paying for you and your lifestyle and supporting your family and your staff and whatever, Office One cannot be messed with. If Office One is collecting 150, 160,000 a month, it needs to continue doing that. And keep in mind, if you stick an associate in there for part of the time, your profitability percentage is going to go down. All right. So I would not abandon what I'm making in Office One with the idea that I'm going to make it in Office Two. All right. I'm going to want to establish a little bit of a different setup in Office One then before I go off and getting a second practice. It also depends on what am I facing in Office Two. Maybe Office Two is an owner doctor who wants to stay on for the next 5-6 years. And even with the debt I'm going to have to take on to buy this practice, it's going to remain profitable. Well, then in that case, it's not that big of a deal because that other owner doctor is going to stay there and I'm going to be okay. But keep in mind, once they revert from being an owner to an associate, they can quit, in which case I'm scrambling to fill that spot with an associate, which I'll talk about here in a second. But in other scenarios could work. Like let's say Office One, you have a couple of associates and you're primarily placing implants a few mornings a week. Well, yeah, you want to go work in Office Two, that works out great. You pop over there for a couple days a week, you come back, you keep placing your implants. Office One doesn't skip a beat, seems to roll. What I'm trying to have you avoid here, and I've seen this happen numerous times, is Office Two is bought and a sort of unstable associate is put in there, and both offices are open 4 days a week. The associate gives their notice. You can't find a new associate, so now you've got Office One and Two only open 3 days a week each, and you are working 6 days a week. I've seen that scenario play out numerous times, folks. So that's the last thing that you want to do. All right. You don't want to have that type of a situation. Ideally, Office One has a couple associates in place so you can break off, or the associate situation in Office Two is fairly stable. All right. Before you go grabbing this office. If it's a retiring doctor, you're going to have to figure something out, which brings us to the next point, right? Which is, if I'm going to do Office Two, am I going it on my own or am I bringing in a partner? So again, let's take that retiring dentist scenario for a second. I'm buying a retiring doctor's office. This office is doing, I don't know, let's say between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. I'm paying $250 for this office. I'm going to have to put $150,000 worth of equipment in there, or maybe less. Let's say $80,000 worth of equipment. So I'm going to be in debt a little over $300,000, right? And I figure what the debt service is going to cost me and whatnot. And I'm going to put an associate in there. All right, because I figure an associate, let's say hygiene's doing 15 to 20 of that production every month. The associate should be able to do okay, and I've factored in that associate's pay, which if you want to know more about associate pay, especially for a second location, we talked about that in an earlier episode, how to pay your associate. But, and I've worked the numbers, and the numbers work. I can do this. So now I'm going to put that associate in there. That can work, and that can work out just fine. The problem is, even if I have a no-compete, that doesn't mean the associate can't quit. I have a contract, but they can still quit. All right? Maybe they're not going to open up down the street, which I've seen happen a lot anyway, but maybe they're going to go a few times over, or they're going to leave town. That associate has no skin in the game. Part of what makes your office work is you have skin in the game. If you look at it ultimately, and it's not ideal, of course, but ultimately, everybody could leave your practice and your practice could still keep its doors open, because the one thing a dental practice needs is a dentist. All right. So you have a vested interest. You own this practice. So it would be ideal if the person you had in Office Two had a similar attitude. Now, I'm not saying you have to add a partner. Corporate does this without adding partners. I'm just telling you, in my opinion, what would I do? Most likely, I would put a person in there with the idea that they're going to start as an associate, with the idea that they eventually could become a partner. And I would have this all in writing before they started. The last thing you want to do, and I talked about this in the associate episode a bit, you don't want to go in there going, hey, if it works out, we'll talk about partnership, because they may think it's working out earlier than you do. And that's where I see about 95% of the associate problems come in that the owner, doctor, and the associate weren't on the same page in writing. But I would probably advise, if you're going to go buying these smaller offices that you're going to scale, I would probably have somebody with the idea that eventually they would become a partner. And they can become a partner with you in Office 3, too, when you bring up the other associate. You're building your own little team of dentists there. It's actually a pretty cool idea. All right, which brings us to the last point, which is, are you starting a scratch practice or are you buying an existing office? Obviously, I asked this question for two reasons. One, I want to make sure the doctor is walking into a positive situation, and I want to see how the office number 2 is going to impact office number 1. Is it a going concern, or are they going to be open 1 or 2 days a week? Because you could be successful either way you go. The most important thing here is you want to make sure that the financials work, right? And how do you know this? You can, with an existing office, it'll have P&Ls and you can see what the expenses are. And then you just have to add on top of that how much an associate is going to cost you and the debt associated with it. And we'll talk about, if there's staff there, what to do with that next. But with a scratch practice, you're really not going to know what that's going. You can estimate what it's going to cost you, and you're going to know the big expenses, rent and things of that nature. And you'll have an idea of what your debt service would be. And you'll have an idea also of what you use in supplies and how much labs cost you, because you're already using them for Office 1. So you can project out the numbers. And I know this may not be your strong point. You may not enjoy doing it, but it's something that you have to absolutely do. You don't want Office 1 to be subsidizing Office 2, at least not indefinitely. It doesn't work, right? Maybe as it's getting going, it works. But with a scratch type situation, it might be a little bit easier, especially if you're on your own in Office number 1, because it's not like there's a lot going on there yet where you're going to have to break yourself off for 3-4 days a week to pick up this already running practice, right? So that's mainly what I want to find out. Because again, remember, Office 1 is sacrosanct. We can't mess that up for the sake of Office 2. All right? Which brings us to the last point. Let's say you're buying an existing practice and there's staff in it. So do you keep the staff? Do you let the staff go? What do you do? Well, that again depends on the situation, right? First off, I have to look at how am I going to staff this office. If it already has an existing staff in it, I'm going to want to look at a few things. How are these folks being paid? What tends to happen in dental practices, especially ones that have been around for 20, 30 plus years, is they end up where, you have dental assistants who are making $38 an hour because they've just gotten incremental raises and a pension and this and that, way above market rates in your area. Well, in that case, you're going to run into a bit of a problem, and you're going to have to make some hard decisions in that point. But assuming that your payroll is relatively in line and the office is fully staffed, well, there's a few things you're going to want to do. I mean, number one, you're going to want to talk to the owner doctor, the current one, and get an honest assessment from the doc on each of these personnel. You're also going to want to look at when those personnel started in the practice and how has the practice done since. So you have an idea of how this doctor rates their job performance as well as how they've affected the office. The next thing you're going to want to do, if you're able to, is observe these staff in action and take a look at, is this how you would want patients handled in your office? Is this okay with you, right? And then obviously beyond the salary issues, right? Because maybe it works for the owner doctor, the current salaries, but it might not work for you with debt and associate. Beyond those, you have to keep a couple things in mind. If this office is successful and productive, remember that the staff that are there helped make it that way, unless they're a brand new employee. So I wouldn't necessarily think that instantaneously I had to get rid of everybody. It might be totally good. And we've seen lots of clients do this. They'll pick up a second office and they were training their current staff, and now they're shipping us some of their new staff from the new office they bought, and they're great people. There's lots. Most people are cool. There's a very small percentage of people are just not good employees. The vast majority of people are actually very productive employees or have the potential to be. And obviously, you're never going to really know about these staff until you work with them yourself. So keep that in mind. If it's not working, don't belabor the point. Don't extend if you don't have to. Now, if the office isn't staffed the way that you want and you're looking at wanting to bring some employees over from office number 1, Couple considerations there. Obviously, number one, Office 1 is sacrosanct, so make sure if you pull somebody out of Office 1 that they get replaced. You might have a dental assistant who's got managerial potential. You train him or her and you replace them, and then they become the manager at the second office. We've seen clients also bring in a prospective manager for Office 2, have them work in Office 1 for a while so they kind of absorb the company culture and then go run Office number 2, and that works out great. So those are the main issues that I'm going to ask a client about if they're looking at adding a second location. There are some other minor ones, which include corporate setup, financial setup, what the degree of managed care is in this practice, if there are a lot of PPOs, the amount of patient flow, how many charts there are. And there's other things to talk about with relation to due diligence when you're actually going and buying an office, things that you're going to look at. We're going to talk about in future episodes. I'm going to have Sabri on, and we're going to have a whole thing on buying that. Whether you're a newer doctor, you're a student, or and you're looking at going into practice in a few years, or you're an associate and you're looking at picking one up, we're going to be talking about practice acquisitions and metrics for practice acquisition in future episodes. But one of the cool things, the last thing I'll say about this is a great time for dentists in private practice to pick up a second office. In earlier episodes, I've talked about what the situation in the dental profession is. You have over 15% of the profession is over 65 and are, approaching or at the point where eventually they're going to retire. We are going to have a dentist shortage for at least a brief period as the years go by. And after 2020, to be real, you had a lot of offices close. It happened. You had quite a few people just decide, I was looking at retiring in 2 years. I'm done now. So there are a decent amount of offices available. So this is a great time if you're an entrepreneurial private dentist to pick up that second or third office. And the great thing, because you might think, corporate's going to pick them up, right? How am I going to compete with corporate? Let me tell you something. This is an area that you are not competing with corporate. This is the beauty of it. Here's the thing. Corporate cannot and does not scale. They don't scale. If you look at the average office that is a corporate acquisition target, it's not an office doing $300,000 or $400,000 a year. It's an office doing 1.2, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million. Corporate wants larger practices. They're not interested in going in and scaling a small office from a retiring doctor. But you know what? Private dentists can scale. So you have tons of opportunity. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It's there. Those are some of the things that I would look at. And I think for the entrepreneurial folks out there, this is a great time to do it. And if you guys have any questions as you've gone through this, I know it was a little bit all over the place, but honestly, I could have done this for hours. There's tons to talk about. But if you have any questions that come up, feel free to email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com. Otherwise, I hope this helps. And if you want to know more about this, or you want some help with these issues, or you just want help with your practice, we offer a free consultation here at MGE. You can sign up for one at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. And if you like the podcast, appreciate if you take a minute and subscribe. This way you'll always get notified when new ones come out. All right, folks, I think that about does it for this week. We will see you at next week's episode. Do well.